We want to welcome you back to our Smart Tech Use for Equity series and our wonderfully small group really engaging on these issues. We are recording each of these sessions and documenting ahas as folks share them so that we can consider a kind of best of reel at the end. So thanks for being willing to let us record. And this series has been really lovely so far in bringing to the table some issues, not only in tech use from the past year and learnings from that sort of under duress tech use that everybody engaged in, but much deeper ahas about equity in teaching that we want to bring back to our classrooms, whether they, hopefully don't go back remote, whether they have little tiny chunks of remote, whether they stay face-to-face. This series is really about putting equity questions in front and tech uses in back, but more as a vehicle for thinking about deep issues of supporting every young person and all groups of young people in our schools in deep ways. And so these are the questions that we are thinking about in this series. We have 7 educators who we are highlighting in a series of 7 weekly presentations. We're thinking about ahas learned during pandemic forced remote teaching, about equity-oriented tech use, and each educator is sharing a tech use that they tried our Smart Tech Use for Equity process on. We'll be sharing a note-taking sheet that every educator used in thinking about an equity vision, trying a tech use last year to see if it would help with that vision, taking notes on the pros and cons of how that tech use went, and then finishing with some equity conclusions about the tech use tried and that bigger equity vision. And so Joe is going to be talking about bigger ahas about engagement and assessment with a specific tech use that he tried last year, and then we'll engage in dialogue about the equity issues in what he shares with us. So Joe, I want to turn it over to you as our next Smart Tech Use for Equity presenter. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you. And luckily all the technology is working right now. Otherwise, I would have felt a little strange presenting on anything technologically related and it not work. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you find this time useful. I'm going to bounce back and forth between a couple of different things because it's the nature of the tool. So if I'm putting things in the chat and you're missing it and you need it again, just please let me know. If you are seeing things on your screen at a certain given point in time and you're wondering what you're looking at, please feel free to use the chat as freely as possible. The goal is to open up the last portion of the session to really discuss and talk about some of the things that came up here. I will preface it by saying, although a lot of what I'm going to do during the presentation uses the tool that I'm talking about, I have no ownership or stake in your use of that tool. So if you like it and you think it'll be useful, that's awesome. But I don't intend on using this as sort of like a training ground for that tool. I do want to show you how it works and how I leveraged it, but it's more about what came from that leveraging and less about the tool itself, if that makes some sense. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about using Perideck in terms of formative assessment throughout pre-pandemic. There wasn't a lot of usage, but once we hit the thick of the pandemic and online learning, it became a very positive learning tool for me in my classroom. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I've transitioned and started to use it again, and some of both the victories and maybe some of the frustrations I've had in returning back to the classroom setting, because I think a lot of us are experiencing the tools and the things that we leverage while online. We're sort of balancing how to re-leverage those things coming back to the classroom, as well as leveraging coming back to the classroom, right? It's all of those things all at once, and sometimes it hits like a ton of bricks. So I'm going to do a couple of things real quick. I'm going to show you when I'm going to pretend for a moment as though you are visualizing this as a student. Now, since I'm going to be talking about Perideck, I'll show you by stealing your screen for a little bit about what it looks like. This is not something I would typically use if we were in the pandemic setting, I would just give the students a link. And so I'm going to do that for you. But now that I'm in the classroom, when I use it, this is a screen that I show to have students join through using this website and entering this code, but that's what they see. But I'm going to bypass that for you today by putting a link to you or for you in the chat. So if you want to go ahead and grab that, by having that link available to you, you'll be able to access the slides as I go through them, and I don't have to share my screen, and I can focus on your faces or your chat or any questions you have. So if you'll just join in there. You'll notice right now, since it is set to be, I don't have to validate or have you validate who you are as an individual. So you'll all be anonymized. You're given an avatar and a nickname. Whereas in the classroom, they are asked to authenticate. And so I will see students' names attached to that, and you won't have that same experience. So if you might not even know what your avatar is at this point, which is totally fine. Okay. You might have also noticed when you came in, Mike and I talked a little bit about this. It asked you how you were feeling today. Did you see that? Yeah, I don't know if you answered honestly or if you answered hopefully, but there are a couple of different options. I'd like to see more of an array of emotions, particularly using it coming back to school. But I did want to touch on that before we even begin today. It's a very interesting question and gives us insight into a little bit about how students feel when they come into the classroom. And I did see a lot of people who were very quick to click the green face sort of at the onset of the pandemic. And then by the end, they were all like non-smiling or non-emotional at all. And so I don't know if that was indicative of their fatigue with online learning or indicative of their fatigue with the tool, or they just did not necessarily care to share the feeling. But I think it's an interesting component of using this tool. So I thought I would put that out there at the very beginning. So to start, I'm really going to look at an exploration of this concept of tequity and accountability using this tool of Perideck. Just a little bit about me. My name is Joe Ferro. I am a consultant with the Writing Project. I currently teach 9th and 10th grade English at Patrick Henry High School in San Diego Unified, but for the purposes of this work, I did move this school year. I did teach at Point Loma High School the past 2 years. Interestingly enough, when I started at Point Loma, I made it all the way to March of the year of the pandemic, and I went back in April of the next year. So I actually spent more time teaching online for the school than I did on campus. And I think that was really, there's a lot of challenges as a teacher in terms of what that's like working at a school and feeling like part of the community. And it did give me a lot of insight into some of those things that students feel, particularly working with freshmen and sophomores and trying to think about how to carve out your space in a school that you've never been to or have spent very little time at. So I think some of the issues that I encountered had to do with the sensitivity of the age level of students. Juniors and seniors had a little bit more experience with being on campus and carving out their space, and freshmen and sophomores were really thrust into this online world and trying to navigate it. And so really trying to find a way to connect them would hopefully be, the tech could be a tool for that at times. So a little bit, just kind of the rundown. I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro of what the smart tech and using Perideck is, which you're on, as you can see me controlling the slides, what I've learned through this process in the pandemic, and anything that's equity oriented that can be applied still remotely, hybrid, or even in the face-to-face setting that we find ourselves in. We'll spend a little bit of time actually using the technology to get a feel for it, but through the lens of how this practice either kind of created a more equitable learning space or at times maybe hindered that. And then some of the key takeaways from the use of this tech and how it relates to equity. What are some of the bigger issues that come to light as a result of that? And in the second half of this, we'll facilitate some of the questions, and hopefully you'll have some input or some thoughts about it. And I'd even like it if I can be stumped, because there are things that I probably have not yet thought about that as I continue to use this tool, I would like to think about. So any polite pushback is also welcome. So in terms of how this came to be, in terms of an equity goal for using Perideck, it was really about assessing student learning and engagement effectively and consistently. I am an English teacher by trade, so using adverbs sometimes makes me a little bit uncomfortable because what do I mean by saying effectively and consistently? I feel like being online made it very challenging to get a sense of who students were as learners. And when we assess, a lot of times we give work to students and we can kind of predict how some of them are going to perform pretty early on, either whether it's effort-based, ability-based, habit-based. We start to kind of have these preconceived notions of who our students can be. But being online last year from day one of the school year, I didn't have any of that. Not with my freshmen. My sophomore students who I had a unique experience that I had most of them as freshmen the year before. But for the purposes of what I'll be talking about today, I'm going to refer mostly to those freshmen because I didn't have any of that sort of previous knowledge of who they were as students. So walking in day one, I needed to figure out how am I going to know who these students are and consistently assess work in a way that's manageable. I managed to make it through an entire school year and not make a single photocopy. So not having physical text with me, how am I going to handle the actual marking and assessing of work? The other thing that I feel like I want to clarify in terms of the equity question is the concept of assessment versus grading. I think this is a hill that I will die on as an educator because I think sometimes the terms are used loosely as synonyms and I don't see them as such. When I think about those two things, I think about grading is assigning this number, this letter to a thing, whereas assessment is how well is a student performing to a standard or a task. And so I wanted to figure out how I can do more of that and less of assigning a number or a letter to an assignment. So that's kind of where this came in and how I could do that more consistently. Brian, I saw a hand. I don't know if you had a question. You can chime in if you do.
Sorry, I was just clapping.
Oh, okay. I'll take that.
Hey, Joe, real quick, do you think we should be, for recording purposes, should we display, should audience not present be able to see what you're talking about?
Sure, I could do that as well. Not a problem.
All right, cool.
There you go. I know it's on their screens, but for the purposes of recording, you can have that as well. So the urgency behind all this was I needed to engage students in order to be able to assess them and to spread the wealth of participation. In a normalized classroom setting, I'm sure we've all experienced that, and I experienced that because I was that kid who sits in the front, consistently raises their hand and becomes indignant when he or she or they is not called on because they have an awful lot to share, right? And so because of that, we have a lot of those students from an equity perspective who are happy to shrink into the background, who really do have great things to say, they just don't say it out loud. So the pandemic and creating an online space actually gave me insight into students that when being in a classroom setting, they might not have had the same level of voice. So when I refer to voice, I'm going to refer to that in terms of their production of work and what they're actually stating, whether it's written or spoken out loud. So some of my vision was to really increase this level of participation within the classroom setting, especially online, and use it as a way to leverage some of that private space. I spent a lot of time with students in terms of not battling to have cameras on. I know there were colleagues, and I'm sure some of you have experienced that as well, and maybe it was even you, that was very important for you to have videos on. And very early on in the pandemic, someone had said something along the lines of, some of our students may be homeless, they may be living in cars, they may be leveraging whatever space they can to have, or they may be sharing it with other brothers and sisters in the same space, and they don't feel comfortable. And then I thought of it in terms of, in any other circumstance, would a student invite me into their personal bedroom space to sit with them to do schoolwork? And so I thought, I'm not going to push the camera thing so much. So how can I see what students are doing if I can't see what students are doing? And so I wanted to be able to better understand what they think and what they know without having to rely on physical call and response and information gathered by being present. And hopefully by doing so, increase student voice. So that's all the background. If we could just maybe take a couple of moments here, if you think, considering whether it was online learning, your experience pre-pandemic, during, post-pandemic, what are some of the challenges we have with assessing student work? So if you just want to give me like an example I'd be okay with shout outs. I can manage that. But if you want to drop a couple things in the chat, I'll take that as well. Yeah, time crunch of individualized feedback. I know there are a couple English teachers in the room. We feel that 100%. Mr. Ferro, you gave me an essay. Student, I have 180 to grade, right? So I 100% understand that. Any other challenges of assessment? Authentic feedback, absolutely. Obtaining samples from students in a one-on-one setting. Yeah, I could see that would be challenging as well. There was another one. Touching base with students for those best next steps, feedback for sure. And even just the way of how do we deliver feedback? Whether or not you're recording it through another program and sending them the voice, are you using prefabricated comment features on Google Classroom? Are you highlighting things on a rubric? I mean, there's a modicum of ways in which we communicate, and I've never found one that works for me consistently. And I think it's because my feedback changes depending on the student and the dynamic of the class. And I just feel like the immediacy of feedback is always a challenge, because I find that I don't feel like I've given a respectful task to students if I cannot return feedback to them in a specific period of time. And so I find that to be my biggest struggle. So thank you for sharing some of those ideas as well. I was thinking about this concept of, assessment and engagement, and how if students are not necessarily engaged in the work, I don't imagine that they would assess as well as students who are genuinely engaged. I just feel like there's a correlation there, whether or not that was anything that I had proven scientifically or done research on. But I liked this quote, and I did find it that research supports the fact that engagement is key to student attitude, efficacy, and achievement, and defines engagement in different ways. So I like the idea of how it does link to achievement. Engagement is defined as the act of being invested in learning. Engaged learners are passionate, hearty, thoughtful, committed, and connected to their work. And I thought about if we can find a way to try to breed that consistently and have evidence of that happening, hopefully I would see an improvement in how my students would be performing on a given assessment task. So I can share this real quick. I just feel like it's a good rundown 1-minute video, but rather than watch it, it will be part of the slides, which will be shared with you because it's only a minute. But it will give you an intro to Perideck. But rather than do that, I figure since we're going to use it anyway, you might just kind of be able to skip over this step. But like I said, it's a really quick 1-minute video that you can check out in the future. In terms of working towards that understanding of equity, the way I look at Perideck and how it integrates into pedagogy is I feel like it gave me insight into like more of my interactions with students. It allowed me to, again, grade less and assess student learning a lot more. It included getting engagement from more students than raise your hand. And I think about that being back in the classroom. If I ask a question now just for a quick informal assessment and I can say something, I'll get like 5 hands. If I call on one and it's the correct answer, what happens to everybody else? Or what I deem is the correct answer, right? I work with stories that are subjective. So if I have one concept in my mind and that student matches it, what if somebody else had something that was really smart, that was adjacent, or was something that I haven't thought of, and I miss out on that? So Perideck kind of created a space where some of my out-of-the-box thinkers or people who got remarkably different insights were able to kind of share that. The other thing that I as a teacher, my favorite question is the simplest one. I often say, what did you notice or what do you observe? And so, if I assigned a reading or a particular task and I ask that the next day through Perideck and students respond, there's such diverse responses, and it allows everybody an opportunity to provide something that they felt was important, regardless of whether or not it's the thing that I want as the teacher, right? I don't really have any clear objective as to what I want out of that response. but rather to create a space for students to be able to provide what it is they need to say. So in terms of like where some of this originated from, and I'm speaking probably to a lot of your experiences when online or hybrid, probably the worst teaching experience I ever had was going back in April. And it wasn't because of students, it was because we were asked to do something that literally was not possible. I don't think anybody did it well. And if somebody said they were doing it well, I want to meet them and shake their hand and ask them all about it. Because when we were hybrid in person, we started with students online 2 days a week while other students were in class, and then they swapped, and then everybody was online Friday. And then everybody was supposed to come back 4 days a week, except the kids didn't want to come back 4 days a week. They were happy being able to make choices. And then we had the kids who had dentist appointments, so they would come to the other class on the next day. And it was just this really convoluted system. So assessing learning consistently was really hard. It basically had to be all online, so that way everything was in the same place, so I could do a good job of it. But if not every student needed to be assessed in that way, sorry, I didn't really have another option for them in order to do my job like as well as possible. I felt like more students had the struggle to be engaged because just the ability to be in people's space and share that energy. I don't feel energy from a computer in the same way that I do when I'm in person. And I think there's a performative aspect of teaching and moving and keeping the energy up. And that kind of buys you some engagement that you don't necessarily get when you are in an online setting. And most importantly, I feel like the students, this is my generalization and my observation, more so than my special education students with IEPs, my English learners struggled more than any other population when it came to being online or in hybrid learning. I think part of that is not having consistent language models. Part of that is not having the support that they would consistently get in a classroom or outside setting in the way that they were used to getting that support. And I think as a teacher, I really struggled to get them to show up. They were the most chronically absent population that I had. And so I wanted to think about how to reach a broader audience of students and how to tap into those who were typically quiet or maybe disengaged for whatever other reason. And also, how do we get kids from turning off their cameras and walking away and going playing video games? How do I know they're even there? Right? Just that practical, how do I know that I marked you present and you're actually present? Perideck was a way of holding them accountable for that as well. So in terms of like how that looks as an equity issue as well, we going behind the one dominant speaker. Perideck sort of serves as this intermediary space where, as you'll see in a little bit, I'll put something out there, there will be a response, I can filter and kind of see who's responding, how he or she or they are responding, and then also use that as an opportunity to affirm students who are doing well, while also welcoming others into the conversation who might not have the confidence to raise their hand or enter the conversation without being encouraged. It serves as a great rehearsal space. And it also allows students to make thinking visible. Whereas a lot of times if things are going on in their heads and they raise their hand and it comes out their mouth, they've never really seen or thought about what that looks like. They've never had that opportunity to self-revise or self-edit. And putting things in a Perideck space allows that to happen as well. We had, in terms of, we can talk about this all day long, but the idea of we have internal tracking, or they did at Point Loma. Part of the reason they don't anymore is blamed on my departure. But it's the idea of, I taught the seminar program. So I had 4 classes of advanced students, and I was able to use similar strategies to engage students in my advanced classes as I was in my non-advanced classes. And it didn't allow me to see it as a privilege for one group of students over another. It allowed everybody to have an entry point the way they needed it. So it sort of built that efficacy in commenting, that every student's response was worthy. And it also sort of broke some of that initial, I think, fear that people have in putting things out into a space. One of the tensions I have, and the best part about being back in person, is seeing students work together. And I've missed that a lot over the past couple of, semesters, because this teaching is social. I remember when I interviewed for my job here at the school, a principal asked me if we walked in your classroom, what would be something we'd see? And I said, it's not what you'd see, it's what you'd hear. I said, my class is loud. Students are going to talk, they're going to interact, because we thrive on interacting. And that is one of the biggest setbacks with this as a tool, is it doesn't create a genuine method to interact without using some other extension. So we can use Google Docs together or a breakout room together and respond on the Perideck, but Perideck itself doesn't facilitate the rich group work like we could using other tools. So in terms of allowing for intelligent groupings, that wouldn't be something that's facilitated through the tool. And that was a challenge thereof. In terms of, from a district perspective, and thinking of it larger than just a school site or my own personal beliefs or biases, this year we're starting to move away from typical grading. So again, assigning letter grades, giving 10 points for turning in a homework, 5% for going to see the play at the school play. I'm sorry, 5 extra credit points. None of that is encouraged or really even allowed. So it's working towards how students are progressing to a given standard. The elementary schools have been using that for years, but now we're sort of being pushed in that direction, or not sort of, we are being pushed in that direction from the secondary perspective. And they even use the term equity-based grading, because it's supposed to allow for students to also receive opportunities to do retakes, to do revisions, and focusing on mastery and proficiency. So some core tension here is that I don't feel like there's been a great rollout of competency-based grading so far. It assesses a skill and doesn't allow you to assess the human component. It also tends to backfire when we're assessing one assignment that's worth 5 times as much, and we have no padding for students to show and get credit for doing the learning. And so, I had a conversation with a student today. He said, what worries me is I want to revise until I show mastery, but who wants to revise the same essay 9 times? And he has a point. So I think that that's another core tension that we're going to experience. A positive thing is it sort of does set high expectations for student learning. You assess it and respond to it and provide that feedback, which is good teaching. That is really easy to not want to do because it's time consuming, and it avoids the A for effort, which oftentimes can be an equity issue, particularly with students who have consistently maybe not performed in a classroom, and they come in with some battle scars, some wounds about compulsory education, and maybe the effort is not what needs to be rewarded, because they just don't have it in them after kind of being beaten down. So what's cool about Perideck is if I'm asking questions consistently related to a standard, I can see mastery build over time. I can see how things are improving, and I can see when students are ready to move on, see because of how the students are responding. For example, this week we started with the sophomores. I started teaching rhetorical analysis, which is not something they need to be masters at in the 4th week of high school of sophomore year, but I can track the questions and save the responses. And then if I ask a similar question, knowing I'm going to do it in the next whatever we're doing, I can see the growth curve in Perideck. Not to say I couldn't do it some other way, but it is an opportunity for me to go back and look at previous things we've done in the course. Now, I will say that I actually put this together and this particular slide together prior to coming back to school. And looking at it with fresh eyes today, it's interesting to see what's happened and maybe what hasn't. I still feel like it's worth it for in-person learning, except that I can't use it with the consistency as I did when we're online, because now all those other tools that were available to me in my toolkit when I was in person are back. And students can interact and we can move around a classroom. So being able to do all those things makes the luster of Perideck and technology has gone. I remember when we first got Promethean boards. My first Promethean board was when I was teaching at Grant, and that was 13 years ago. And all students were so excited to come up and touch the board, and it was all the rage for about 2 years, and then students just didn't care anymore. That luster had worn off to a certain degree. And I think that's the same thing with Perideck. Like, it's good when you use it for a purpose and not just because it's there. So I've been using it for entry and exit slips. I've been using it when I want to see students manipulate text. And anytime I have a particular standard that I want everybody to make sure they're doing. Because on Perideck, if it's in class, I can see immediately, and I'll show you in a moment, which students are responding and who is not responding. Whereas if it's an assignment in Canvas, for example, and a student's like, I'm not going to do it, how do you assess something a student doesn't do? But on Perideck, they feel compelled. And so I can look and assess every single student, maybe minus 1 or 2. Whereas if it's on Canvas, I get maybe 75% of students turning it in. So I like that component of it as well. Like I said already, the other 2 things, it's lost its luster for some of them. And when you have other things that you can do with the student interaction that's authentic, they're social creatures. I don't know if you knew that about high schoolers, but they're social. And so the idea of being able to encourage that is really sort of an ideal situation for them. So I just wanted to show you this real quick, just to kind of give you an experience. If you haven't used it, or even if you have, how likely are you to use it in your present setting? So you can see on the slides, you can drag it. I just wanted to show you a couple of the features so you can understand when I'm talking about what I can see. And for those of you who've never seen it, I'll share that with you. So I'm only going to stop sharing for a moment so I can switch screens and make sure you can see it. And you can put in a response there. Should be able to show you. So you can kind of see where people, I don't know how large it could be on your screen. You can see where people are. Now, if I wanted to, I can hover over and see where people are. I have some people who are unlikely. I have some people who are maybes. I have some people who, when they see what other people are doing, are moving theirs around, which actually happens in the classroom. It's like this weird peer pressure. I can see that one person has not responded. I could look at who it was if I clicked on my class roster, which again, you should all be anonymous. So I can click on the roster and see who's there. I can see if I scroll down here that dinosaur has not responded, whoever the dinosaur is. So it gives you a little bit of an idea on kind of what I see. This is a really good litmus. Oftentimes, I'll just ask a question like, how did you feel about last night's reading? How well did you understand it? And you'll see some of those questions in there. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes just to play before we open up for some questions, just so you can see like visually what it looks like. So I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to share the teacher screen with you so you can see responses. But I'd like you can just casually enter responses just to see the way things show up. Not worrying about accuracy or fidelity in the responses, but rather just to kind of see how it would look and how it was used in the classroom setting. So if I go to the next question here, I'm going to show you in action. One of the things I do to kick off, we read The Kite Runner last year. I'll show you some of the opening things we did at the very first couple of days. So for example, having them search the web, look up the author, see if there's anything that they can infer about the types of things that might be important to this writer. So you can see this is the slide, but when I look at the teacher screen, and it may or may not let me shift. So hold on. I don't know if you can see this or nope, it didn't. I have to reshare, sorry. Does this when I switch between these 2 screens. If I show you the student responses, you can see that I have one response from Rhino. What I can do as well is I can star this response, and then on Perideck, I can show students good responses. So again, this probably will not let me switch screens. There we go. I have to stop share and reshare, which is kind of annoying for you. I apologize. But I can go here and click show student responses. And what's nice about it is it keeps the anonymity. So how do I can just select the ones I want and put on the screen. Like if I wanted to model, right now I'm showing all responses. So it's nice because I can call out a student who maybe I interpret or know is shy, or a student who doesn't normally feel like he or she would be called on. And I can put it up on the screen and give that student some confidence in the response that was given. I can show you a couple other things that we did. Something like they can a short answer like, what is the effect of the opening lines, which is also a really great mentor text. So you can ask questions like that. I do things like, how's the book so far? So they come in after reading the first few pages. How are they feeling? I like to ask it beginning, middle, and end of the book. And I like to see how many people like or don't like. It doesn't always affect whether or not I'm going to teach a novel again, but they're honest. And I like, even though I can hover over the little dot and see which student it is, I do preserve their anonymity, because it doesn't matter to me if a student, one particular student doesn't like it. I'm not going to hunt him or her down and say, why didn't you like the book? But it does give me a litmus of understanding how my overall class is reacting to a text. And then if I did want to go in later and say, okay, what were some of the concerns you have, or why is it you don't like it? I can ask that at another time. We spend time like lifting lines, and it says we would be in breakout rooms for something like this. And then they would pick lines together, and then as a group come up with one word to describe all the characters mentioned. They would put that in the Perideck when they come back in. So that was how we modified group work. They would go out and do it in one place, but the Perideck would be sort of where everything would be put on public display and shared for the benefit of the group. And then this is another one, like what character archetypes. This was like a multiple choice question to give them an idea. And we would talk about why we noticed some trends. That was the other thing that was cool. And I didn't even think about this till just now. If I were to display your responses, it would show as a bar graph. And we would talk about the trends and maybe say, what does this suggest about the way we're interpreting the character? Why do you think most of us are picking this? This one was only selected one time. Why do you think this individual is gravitating towards this response? So we could actually like look at the data and kind of interpret the book through what everybody was saying. And so that gave everybody access to like a visual of the responses. Highlighting passages. This is really actually a very good tool that I use at least daily. We talk about passages, because then what it will show me is I can notice where majority of students are pointing things out. Are they noticing the thing that I'm asking about? Or are they noticing something adjacent? Or are they missing the mark? And if so, who's missing the mark? What do I need to reteach? When do I need to repractice this skill? So, and it can all be done anonymously. Or if I look at the particular student and say, oh, come here, I want to talk to you after class. Hey, I noticed on this response today, you were close to it. It's like, can you explain your thinking, right? So it allows me to kind of engage with a student in a way that would allow that student to get what he or she or they needs in a way that would be slightly different from just having them write things on paper. And so I think we're good. I think I got through all of that. And I know that we wanted to open up for some questions or comments in the chat in person. Kim, I don't know if you want to field anything from the chat, or I can.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to invite people who are listening to think about this tool and how it might work in your setting. I have such I'm so driven by the word you use, Joe, compelled. And I'm wondering how this tool compels students in ways that other tools don't. And I was wondering, is it because it becomes a slide deck, or like what are the reasons for the compelling nature of this tool versus, there's so many other tools out there. So that was where I got struck by that, and I had to write it down. And I was just wondering, like, what role does that play, and how does it compel students, I guess, is my curiosity, because I guess in some ways I don't feel compelled by some of the questions. And it's like, ooh, now I feel like after you said somebody didn't answer, I guess I better get on it, right? But
Right.
is that the compelling?
So I like the word compelling and like compulsion, just the idea of like the rhyme of the ancient mariner, like the guy has this compulsion to tell this story, like he can't help it. And I think the second that you make the learning aspect social and public, it becomes sort of compelling. And it doesn't even have to be that I say dinosaur or Kim didn't respond, because I wouldn't publicly do that. But what I can say is I can say, okay, I'm still waiting for 3 of your responses, but I can see who they are. And then I can politely message them in the chat. Hey, can you share your thinking so I can know, can you contribute? I can be encouraging, and I can also be passive aggressive, right? Like it depends on which way you want to approach it with the student, but it allows, and then I can also say, sometimes there were times where I said, if you don't know the answer or you didn't do the reading, I need you to tell me, just be honest that you didn't do it. So I'm not sitting here waiting for you on this particular response, because I can't assess what you didn't do. So I think knowing also that at any point in time, I could see a response, and then it was sort of became an expectation and an understanding that if you're putting it out there and I like your response, I might ask you to share. And I think the accountability factor of it was definitely something that I think created that tendency towards doing it. And then I did have some students who would never respond. And those were the students who I had to have other conversations with or contact parents, because at that point, it wasn't about they weren't using Perideck. It was that I don't know what they're learning. And I have other ways of assessing. We had other assignments in Canvas, but the day in and day out, like grind of being able to understand what the students were doing, I would say at least 70% was relying on this tool. Now, I'm not saying that that was a good thing, but it allowed me to do things that I couldn't do with quite the same efficacy or frequency if I used a different tool or a different method of assessing, if that makes sense. So I think all of those things kind of led to it being more compelling for them.
I have this question in the chat. Sorry, I froze and disappeared there for a few minutes.
Yes, that's fine.
I'm really struck by, and have been since I first learned about what you were doing, Joe, by the idea of going deep equity vision, of going beyond the dominant guy in the front. I think that's a huge aha. And at the same time, I see you trying to use this to get many more voices raised beyond that one dominant guy in the front, and therefore be able to assess more students' learning and competency building and stuff. So my question kind of on the con end, that's a big pro, I think. On the con end is, like the depth of the engagement. And I wonder if you could say something about that. Like you're hearing lots of voices. Are they, did students say deeper things in this mode than they would if they had raised their hand and said it verbally? Sort of pros and cons, more voices heard, but are there any negatives to the way they were heard?
I think in terms of depth, just the concept of, I mentioned it before, is that idea of making thinking visible. The fact that Perideck required written responses can be a pro or a con in itself as far as equity, particularly if you're thinking about students who don't see themselves as writers, who don't feel like they're strong writers, who don't like to write, who have language barriers. All of those things could lead to making writing complicated. However, it's fascinating because as students are writing, I can watch them. And so if I'm watching the responses come in, I also watch them revise on the spot. So sometimes they'll start typing and they'll delete their response, and I'll be like, no, Kim, why did you delete that? You were onto something. Please go back and do that. Like, continue with that. And also, like, I would preface it by saying, don't worry about spelling and grammar, because what I need is your ideas. I don't need your editing right now. And so to a certain degree, the fact that they had to think it, write it, read it, revise it, there were a lot of good things that were happening that don't happen when you raise your hand and just shout out, right? Because I know that the depth of students don't respond in the same way when they're writing as they do out loud. And if they do, those are the things we try to like teach out of them when they're writing, because we want their writing to bear a certain level of sophistication. And I think Perideck did allow for that sort of depth, but it also allowed students who maybe weren't your strongest in writing to still put something out there and to see it and to encourage the idea behind the writing, because that's what we wanted. We wanted the thought. Like, I wasn't assessing the writing, I was assessing the ideas and how well they were trying to communicate their thinking. So I think it is a pro and a con. And I do see there being limitations for students who have limited language or are struggling with certain kinds of thinking. But I will also say I could see more of that and address more of that because they're doing the work than sometimes in other traditional assignments. So it was a pro and a con in itself.
Mm-hmm. Right, or as they're learning English, they're struggling to do that rather than limited language overall. I think Courtney has this question here, or a point about, and then we should get SM in. Courtney, you want to raise your point a little bit about lined paper?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I wonder if, and this would be from the student perspective, of course, but if typing in a response into that little bubbly, space in a Perideck feels different perhaps than like committing a response to a lined piece of paper that they're going to have to turn into a teacher. Like, I mean, they both end up with you, Joe, ultimately, like the responses end up in your hands, but I wonder if there's a more social, like almost like the idea of a chat or, that kind of thing, a more social kind of nature here, where maybe it lowers the, I don't know if I have the word for this, the entry point of, a student feeling like they can or want to take a risk of saying something. Did you notice anything about maybe more students being willing to participate in Perideck versus who would normally like commit things to paper? I guess is kind of what I'm wondering.
I think that's something that I can investigate more now because it wasn't really, I didn't have the opportunity to investigate it under the circumstance where we were fully online. But I think once I saw your question, my brain went where yours did. I know that even the little bubbles while they're writing do like a ... thing. It looks like when they text each other. So I think there's just such it feels like more authentic to them communication than writing on paper does. Right. And so I think in terms of authentic communication, like they don't write letters, they write emails, right? Those are the kinds of things that have shifted into this digital world. And I think that that's not true for everybody. And so sometimes if they don't have access to things where they're communicating in that way, maybe they would have preferred paper versus, but I will tell you, if they had an option to write on paper in pencil or Perideck, it would be a different question than writing in pen. There's something about like committing to pen as like fatalistic, like I cannot undo my mistakes, that the computer is nice because they just hit backspace, right? But the computer is also bad when you're teaching writing because they hit backspace and then they can't track their revisions or they don't track their thinking. Whereas on paper, it can get messy and you can see their thinking. So, I mean, for the most like responses, I would say that they felt comfortable because it related to a world that they typically live in. But I think it would be interesting to do a survey and ask them a question, be like, here's an option, you can write it on paper on Perideck, what would you prefer? And I think some of that might just come down to personal preference, which I didn't take into account because I don't really feel like I could have under the circumstance, but now I can, so.
How about SM's question in the chat there? There's kind of a ongoing discussion about whether comments go straight to teacher individually or whether they can see one another's, and then also can they choose whether they're who views what they post. SM, do you want to add anything there, or did I sum it up?
Yeah, that's about accurate. I mean, when we're chatting in Zoom, there are times where I would not have public chat in a classroom just because, again, by the nature maybe the students or the work that we're doing, and I know that it might slow things down as far as like them going off topic, like completely off topic when you don't need them to be or don't want them to be. And there are times where like, okay, I'll open it up and they can share those thoughts publicly. And invariably I'll still have students who will go both ways, right? They'll both do public and they'll both do private chat, depending on how they personally feel about their response. So, is there a way for them to let you know whether that's then they can code it? Like if you kind of all agree upon a coding system of like, okay, you put okay at the end and that means it's okay for you to share out to the class, or, you leave it off. That means that'll just be to me and I won't, credit the thought to you. Because I know that in times I've said, oh yeah, there's a really great idea. Somebody said whatever, and I'm not attributing it to Mica because Mica sent it to me private. And so I know that she does not want to be called out in that way, but it's still obviously validating for the student to know that I, think highly of that that response or whatever, right? So just I guess kind of along those lines, I like the idea of it because, you know, part of my struggle is like I felt like engagement to a degree was higher because now I got to hear all those different voices that I wouldn't necessarily hear in a classroom through the online with chat and stuff like that. And so like for me, it's like, okay, well, I could use like individual whiteboards and I could like try to figure out other methods to still get that replication in some way, shape, or form. So I like that, you know, this will allow that. But again, I'm just trying to figure out, is there a way to, or have you been able to try it out with public, private call outs, I guess, you know, them acknowledging that it's okay to say, Mica said whatever, versus somebody said, and Mica just silently knows that, oh my God, the teacher thought my idea was great. Like, and maybe next time Mica will be able to say that it's okay to share out.
So, okay, lots of good questions. I want to go back to Courtney real quick, only because I just thought of something. I think part of the reason why Perideck might be compelling for them too is because they type faster than they write. So that might be part of it too, or at least a lot of them do. So that might be something to think about. But to go back to the last, the question that you asked about being on private versus public, when they type their responses, I'm the only one who can see the responses. So as a teacher, when I showed you that window as they were coming in, that's what I see, and it will be attached to a student name. I do sort of have a public policy that students, for the most part, do not write things on there that they wouldn't be willing to share publicly. So there's kind of that understanding. But also, you noticed when I showed the screen and you saw the responses on the big screen, those don't show student names. So it would be something like, if I read it, I wouldn't attribute it to anybody unless I cleared it with a student first. But oftentimes too, before they would even respond to a question, I would say things like, I'm going to select 3 people to read his or their response at the end of this. And I would notify them in the chat prior, so that way they can either accept or decline. And then sometimes they would accept if I read it and didn't share it formally, like, or didn't attribute it to them. So yes to your questions and no to your questions. So it was just really dependent on the circumstance, but it would never be public like a Zoom chat. It would always be private to me first, always. There was no way for students to see other students' responses prior to me filtering it. Oh, I just got lost in the dark. So, gotta stand. There we go. Okay.
And so with our 6 minutes left, and you may have talked more about this, Joe, that went while I was frozen, but you said the luster is kind of off of this tool specifically after so much use maybe, but like, what are your main takeaways right now about this effort to, you know, invite as much engagement as you can in order to then assess as many folks learning as you can? What are you going to do now?
If I had all the same students as I had last year, I would say that the luster would certainly wear off because we used it a lot. And I think the luster is wearing off not because of the tech tool, but because of technology in general. They've been on computers, dependent upon computers for online learning, a lot of the students that I have, for over a year. And not to mention, a lot of them are dependent upon technology because teachers opt to use the technology in spite of there also being other tools. So I think there's just tech fatigue. And again, it's not necessarily the tool. So using it more strategically is still effective, like when I use it, as opposed to just using it all day, every day, because I don't have a method of working with students otherwise. And also, I think making clear to the students, like any other thing I do in class, is what is the purpose behind using this tool today? By using Perideck today, when you're responding to this question, I'm able to look at how you're addressing the standard. How are you making progress? I'm also able to interpret how you're understanding your reading. So helping them to understand why the tool is being used in the first place, I think alleviates some of that tension as well. So although it is not as shiny and new as when you get your new computer and you get to use it in school for the first time, some of that is just because they've been using technology in general. So I think that might be more of the culprit in this scenario than this particular tech tool itself.
And with beyond the tech tool, any other strategies that you are lifting out of this experiment of, sort of getting more voices in so that you can assess more learning? They have nothing to do with Perideck you're doing now that you're face-to-face that's not tech-based to achieve the same end?
I think it's just reminded me of the importance of rehearsal time. I mean, just as simple as that, in the day in and day out grind of teaching, sometimes the simplest pedagogical things that we learned as new teachers are the things that go away because we have all these new things that we try out, that sometimes the most tested and true things are pair shares and turn and talk and to with by and all those things that are just like the rudiments of being an educator. But I do think that I've always taken to mind, if a task can be done in another way more efficiently, why are we using the tool? And so I think that speaks to a little bit of like what Courtney was asking before. Like, it just makes me more aware of, am I using this just to have a different method of engagement because what I was doing before, or they seem like bored with this other thing and I just need to interject some like liveliness, or am I using it because it truly benefits and gives me a better sense of their learning? Right? Because sometimes it might just be because they need some bells and whistles that day and we need to give them something different. But I need to be true and come to terms with myself and understand why I'm using that tool and I'm using it, not just for the sake of being consistent, right? So I think that's one of my takeaways, is just giving them the rehearsal time, letting them have many opportunities, and again, setting clear purpose and expectations for why we're doing the things we're doing, because oftentimes it's hard to hold someone accountable for something if they don't understand why they're doing it in the first place, right?
It also seems, Joe, to me like you are really embracing formative assessment, right? That you're using it more intentionally maybe than you were before, because this is a way not just of having students be accountable, but of helping you know them and their learning more intimately, which is, an interesting piece to think about. I mean, we value formative assessment, but sometimes it can become so informal that we don't actually name it, right? And
Right.
You're now naming it more, and maybe Perideck helped with that.
Yeah, it probably did. And I think it was just really good timing too, with like the onset of this new standards-based grading or equity-based grading practices that we're trying to implement. So good timing.
Fabulous. A lot of deep ahas here today, and thank you for them, Joe. We are going to have several more events in our series. We also want to give to folks the note-taking sheet to do this very kind of big equity vision, pro-con analysis that we've been trying to model here with this series. So thank you, Angela, who is the best. There it is in the chat, and it should be on one of our slides as well as we head out. But next time, we're going to have Tina Banner talking about promoting student discourse for all learners, in this case through online math tools. Again, the bigger aha and quest to promote student discourse for all learners will be in front when she presents next time. So thanks a million, Joe. Thanks to everybody who came. We will be making this available online on schooltalking.org as we have been, and we hope to see you next time. Angela, you want to share this series as we head out?
Yeah, just a quick promo to our conference that we're having for the San Diego Area Writing Project, in case you're available, Saturday, October 2nd. Here's a quick sneak peek at our titles, some of our titles that we're having. So if you're interested, the link, I'll put it in the chat as well. And thank you so much for joining us today, and hope to see you next week as well for Tina's session.
Thanks a million. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thanks, Joe.